From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by a cloud guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. And I was going to say welcome back to the podcast, but this one's actually a little different because in continuing our theme of kind of crossover podcasts, this one's a crossover. So this is Aaron from the Cloudcast, if you don't know me. And my co-host this week, I'll let him introduce and introduce his podcast as well. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks, Aaron. Yes, Tyler Britten from the Pod CTL podcast, where we cover the Kubernetes community.
Yeah, and so what's going on here is there's kind of some common themes here and some things that have been going on. So for the Cloudcast, the show that's releasing this week, it's been kind of a bunch of firsts and a bunch of crossovers that have been going on lately. So the show that will publish this week actually has two separate guests from the past who then left their companies, got together at the same company, and we now recorded a show with both of them. And we're doing a lot of the same, where we're kind of mixing and mashing everything together here. And so Brian was not able to make it this week, but he's actually co-host on both of these podcasts. And this is containers and container security is what we're going to talk about, and container vulnerability today. So we wanted to kind of get this together and kind of put our heads together and have a really great guest this week. This week we have Liz Rice, Technology Evangelist at Aqua Security. Liz, how are you doing today?
I'm really well. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so welcome to the show. So tell us real quick a little bit about your background and the type of things you're working on these days.
Yeah, so my background is engineering. I spent a lot of my early career writing kind of network protocol stacks, spent a little bit of time away from that, more in a kind of product management role, got back into engineering, got back into just around the same time as containers were starting to take off. I was actually at the tail end of a startup that was failing. And a really good friend, an ex-colleague, said, "Hey, you should get into this containers thing. It's really interesting." And we also co-founded a startup that, ran out of money, as these things do. But I learned a ton about containers doing that, and kind of knew that this was an area that I was really interested in. And then about a year ago, I met the team from Aqua Security and joined the team. And so since then, I guess I've been focusing quite a lot on the security aspects of containers. But in my job, I'm really lucky because I get to kind of explore bits of technology that I think are interesting. And quite often they're related to security. It's usually container related. But I really have the best fun time kind of writing and talking about bits of tech that I think are exciting.
And speaking of talking, and this is what actually got us connected together. So the good folks over at O'Reilly put us in touch with you because we've been a good partner with O'Reilly for a number of years now, and we have O'Reilly conference season coming up. We have Velocity coming up. We have OSCON coming up. And just so you know, the code's in the show notes, but there is a promo code CLOUD. If you use promo code CLOUD for registration of those conferences, you actually get a 20% discount, and you will be speaking there. And so tell us a little bit about that as well. I know you've spoken in the past, and is it changed from your previous speaking with O'Reilly to this time?
Well, I'm doing a new talk, so it'll be a little bit different, and it was always going to be slightly different. I like the O'Reilly conferences, and I've done a bit of content for them on the Safari platform as well. So they're good folks, and I think they provide a huge amount of educational content. It's great. So I'm excited to go, and it's kind of fun because Velocity is the same week as DockerCon as well. So there's going to be a ton of container folks in the Valley all at the same time.
Yeah. So speaking of Docker, we can kind of let's start there. Kind of backing up to listeners of both podcasts know a good little bit about containers. And the initial attraction to stuff like Docker was, oh wow, really cool. I can write a Docker file, and then it has all my stuff in it, and it builds it into this container, and I'm all set. I can just say, from trustee, and then put my stuff in here, and I'm good to go. How do vulnerabilities get kind of into that process? How do how does a container vulnerability sort of surface?
So there's a few different sort of angles to this. I mean, one is most people are building their container images based on some, on top of some other image. They've got a from line. You can have from scratch, and you can build your, just put your standalone executable like a Go program. That's but that's a pretty minority case. Most people have got dependencies in those container images. And as soon as you have dependencies, you have the possibility of vulnerabilities. I mean, you could have vulnerabilities in your own application code as well, but the dependencies are kind of where a lot of the exploits get found. And one of the things you want to do is make sure that the image you're building from doesn't contain high severity vulnerabilities. And this is where image scanning comes in. And of course, these vulnerabilities get found over time. Things like when I think it was Heartbleed was the one that was in code that hadn't actually been modified for a very long time. Vulnerabilities get discovered by research teams, sometimes in some really old code. So you want to be scanning these images on a regular basis. At any time, a new vulnerability could be found. It could turn out to be really serious, and you want to be alerted to that and essentially take patches or update those libraries, update the base image to make sure that you've got the patch and you're not running with those vulnerabilities.
So because it's basically, it's Linux, right? Like whatever you're starting with there, these are generally Linux or or code vulnerabilities or things like that. So it's things like you mentioned Heartbleed, which affected, a ton of systems. Where kind of, scanning there's two pieces, right? The thing you're looking at, and then the thing you're comparing it to. How are those lists or what have you put together? How do you decide what you're scanning in a container?
Yeah. So typically what you're going to do is you're going to look at the package manager for that particular distribution. And this is where things get sort of slightly complex, because different distributions have different package managers. And those package managers may treat patching in different ways. Some distributions will, like Debian is a really good example of this, where they will tend to not update packages very frequently. They're very much going for stability. So if a vulnerability gets found in some relatively older piece of code, they might need to take a patch, but they're not necessarily going to take the full update. So maybe some arbitrary library, they've got version 3.0. and the newest version is 3.5. And they'd say, actually, I don't want to take 3.5. I just want to back apply the patch to 3.0. Now, this kind of complicates the vulnerability detection, because the way people kind of report or sort of know about vulnerabilities, there's this thing called the National Vulnerability Database, and it maps vulnerabilities to versions of software packages. And it might say that 3.0 version has this terrible vulnerability, but well, not necessarily. If you've got the version that's been patched by Debian, but the vulnerability database, the NVD, doesn't know about the different patches that you get from these different distributions. So while at one level, finding out what vulnerabilities are in which different libraries seems like it should be a case of just looking them up in the National Vulnerability Database, in reality, you also want to have some knowledge of the distribution and how the distribution is handling these different vulnerabilities. So you're kind of combining information from these different sources.
So does that lead to, it sounds like that could lead to a good bit of false positives as well with scanning.
That's exactly right. And that's where the kind of the danger lies, right? The kind of the boy who cries wolf. You know, if you've got if your image scanning process tells you have tons of vulnerabilities, and then you look into it and you discover, oh no, actually we don't have tons of vulnerabilities, then you might not really pay attention when something that is actually serious gets flagged. So that's kind of where different vulnerability scanners can differentiate themselves by trying to eliminate false positives.
And it almost seems like there's almost two big variables when it comes to this. There's what you scan, which we've been talking about, but there's also probably where you scan. Like, is it up to CI/CD system, the host OS, the registry? Like, there's all these different areas it could reside. And so is there a general hierarchy or rule, or is it the ultimate of, answer of it depends, or is it the ultimate answer of yes everywhere? Tell us a little bit about that.
It's kind of yes everywhere. Yeah. So for enterprise customers, which is what we primarily deal with at Aqua, a lot of the time they're going to be running their own private registry. They might not necessarily want to trust pulling images from a public registry directly into their production system. So they will want to do scanning typically as part of their CI/CD system. You know, you build your image, and then before you push it into the registry, you scan it. And there are a few different sort of options. You could scan after the registry. You want to continually scan the images that you are running in production. Maybe you want to scan all the images in your registry because of this issue of new vulnerabilities being found in existing code. But yeah, typically hooked into the CI/CD system is the main place where we see it being done.
Is that kind of how container signing can come in too? So if you scanned a particular image, and then you can kind of know where that exact image is running. So hey, we found this image in our registry. There's a new vulnerability, and you know what? This image has it. Let's see where we're running that.
Yeah, right. So knowing which images are running where is one side of that. And again, there are tools like Aqua that can help you with that. And then there's also the signing. You know, knowing that the image that you are looking at really is the image you think it is, that, you haven't had some kind of man-in-the-middle attack that's inserted an image that is not the image that you intended to run, which can happen. So that's where image signing comes in, and things like the update framework, doing some really good work there on being able to sort of establish provenance of your image. So yeah, it's kind of, there's a lot of different pieces to this, a lot of moving parts, and depending on your your application, your appetite for risk, you might need more or fewer of these things. If you're talking about a personal WordPress site, you can probably just pull the image from Docker Hub, and that's fine. But if you're a bank, you're probably more leaning towards having signed images and having your own registry and having your own image scanning, sort of enterprise level image scanning baked into that CI/CD process. And you may even also be looking at image policies. A lot of enterprises have policies around what those base images are allowed to be. So they're kind of minimizing the set of different options, they're not having different developers all coming up with different sets of vulnerabilities in their base images. They're all running from a common one.
And so how does it? So if I flip it on its head for a second and not just go for vulnerabilities, what about the compliance aspect of all of this? Because when you bring that up, I immediately go to, okay, great. Everyone should be doing this, but how do we verify they are doing this? How do you verify after the fact as well?
Yeah, some of the requirements around logging, I think, here are sort of having an audit trail for everything that you've pulled and being able to sort of go back and look at the trail of how any particular image got into your deployment is really important for a lot of compliance reasons.
And is there do you also then get a problem of a signal to noise ratio of you're logging all of these things, but again, the more you break microservices down and the more containers you have, the more logging you have, the more ingestion you have, and it becomes harder and harder to find the needle in the haystack.
Absolutely, yeah.
and so how do you deal with that, or what is maybe some guides for folks out there of, okay, I'm starting to think about this and I want to put this framework in place, but then how do I know it's working, or how do I trace things back to their root?
Yeah, so I think this is an area that work is still being done. So, for example, if we look at something a bit more open source, things like Grapheus, which are looking at being able to store metadata about software artifacts in general, not just container images, but they're really looking at an API, a sort of standardized API for being able to store this kind of history of what's been updated, when and by whom. So at that level, I think there's a lot of work that is continuing to go on in the open source world to make that easier. The other answer to that is, logs go into your enterprise SIEM system, your logging system, and it's the same problem as any other kind of logging filtering issue that you've got to be able to search through your logs, find the interesting ones, dig out the things that are relevant for the particular forensics you're looking for, and that would be often handled by the logging system or the SIEM system.
So that brings kind of an interesting angle. Is everything we've been talking about, distributions and package management stuff. It's all Linux centric, Linux containers. That's pretty much what people are doing. We've had a number of conversations, at least on our podcast, with some people from Microsoft and just about Windows containers in general. Have you seen anything kind of on that front starting to happen with Windows container vulnerabilities? How are they figuring out how they're going to do the same sort of processes, how you scan it? I would think on one hand it would be easier because it's not all these different Linux distributions, it's one OS, but at the same time the tools I'm sure aren't anywhere near as mature.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's something that at Aqua we see a lot of demand for. There are a ton of people who have a lot of developers in .NET, say, for example, and they want to take advantage of containers. So ensuring that they're not introducing vulnerabilities is just as important for them. Personally, I am not as expert in Windows as I am in Linux, so you could very easily ask me a question that I won't be able to answer. The principle of Windows container is very similar to the principle of a Linux container. So it's the same kind of issue, and we support Windows container scanning, so it works. You can apply the same kind of principles, and Microsoft are obviously fully behind the move to containerization, and we
Liz,
work with.
let me just kind of follow up with that though, and just a kind of a twofold question. First off, from a trends standpoint, how much adoption are you seeing in the Windows space versus Linux space as far as growth? Is it that the Windows space, you're seeing decently dramatic growth and demand for more features and more robust solutions there? Or is it still somewhat niche-y, is my first question. And then I'll go on to the second one after that.
I think it would be fair to say that the market is more evolved in the Linux world. And even there, there are, there's still a huge long tail of enterprises who are just starting to embrace containers and just starting to explore how they're going to handle all these security aspects of containers. And I think it would be fair to say that the Windows container market is, some steps behind where the Linux world is. But, there's a huge installed base of Windows users, Windows enterprises, Windows, based operations, and they're not going to move to Linux. They want Windows container support, and I'm sure that if you spoke to Microsoft, they would be fully embracing the idea of Windows containers taking off.
And really, this is the second part of my question is that's what I was hoping you would say. So this is actually a question for both you and Tyler. Okay? Let's say there is a huge demand that is out there, and let's also say that that space is slightly behind, if you will. What do you think needs to happen? Is it additional tools that aren't there today? Is it additional education of the developers and DevOps folks that are out there? Like, what are the next steps that you think have to happen in that space to increase adoption?
That's a difficult question. And I think a big part of that is that it is largely under sort of Microsoft's control, because, Windows is not the kind of open operating system that Linux is. So they get to kind of define and determine the roadmap, but they also don't have the benefit of an entire globe's worth of developers trying to push things forward, for them in the open source world. It's a Microsoft question. That
fair enough.
Yeah, I think
they could do everything, right? They have an amazing team, so they're in the right place to do it.
Yeah, and I think they've made some of the moves we've seen in the last year or two with some of the acquisitions, like Dace, and some of the people they've hired, like Brendan Burns coming in from Google, from the Kubernetes team. So I think, and even we saw recently in the last, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, a reorg inside Microsoft and how kind of the operating system group is set up. I think there's two pieces to it, right? There's the operating system side where, like you said, the Linux fundamentals for containers have been there for way longer. So that's the stuff that Microsoft's kind of working pretty hard at, and you even see with Server 2016 that stuff's there. And then the next piece is, kind of the market's pretty much settled on Kubernetes as the container orchestrator. So making sure Kubernetes can support Windows is really key. And that's, I believe, still, as we talked about in our 1.10 show, that it's still a beta as of now. But I expect, once that's, fully established, where it's a, kind of a stable offering people can get, and more customers are on Server 2016 and newer, I think it'll really start to pick up, because then you'll have the other tooling that's missing there can really start to get. Some of it will be like, hey, well, we work with Kubernetes, so it doesn't matter that's on Windows, we work there, which we've seen with some of the stuff. And the other things can then really start to rapidly catch up, because they have not just the frameworks they need from Microsoft, but then also as Liz kind of pointed out, the ravenous install base waiting for it.
Fair enough. No, that makes sense. I really like that. Okay. So we're about at that time. So Liz, where can everyone find out more about you, find out more about Aqua Security, look up the upcoming speaking engagements, etc.?
So Aqua Security is at aquasec.com, AQUASEC.com. I have my own site, lizrice.com, which I occasionally keep up to date with where I'll be speaking. It's going to be a busy summer, I think, with KubeCon and Velocity and DockerCon and a few other interesting conferences coming up. So if you're listening and you hear this, come and say, hi, I heard you speaking on that Cloudcast podcast, and I will very much say hello.
Awesome. And Tyler, for those that don't listen to yours, why don't you pimp your stuff real quick as well?
Yeah, check out the Pod CTL podcast, where we kind of focus on all things Kubernetes. So if you like catching up what's going on with pretty focused on the container space, check us out. And then if you're catching this on PodTTL and looking to see some things broader in the overall cloud space, this is where it's time to check out the Cloudcast.
Yeah, and so I'll finish it off and just say, for those that haven't listened to the Cloudcast before, it's at the Cloudcast.net on Twitter and the Cloudcast.net. And so for that, everyone, thank you very much for your time today. And on behalf of Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week, thank you everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.